The following paid program is furnished by The Coalition. It's for basic entertainment and informational purposes only and is solely responsible for its content. It does not necessarily reflect the views of Cumulus Media, its management, or its staff.
This song don't give a damn.
And yes, we are The Coalition, loud and proud, outrage-born-free, civilly disobedient radio. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On the mighty Twitter, Coalition_radio. Of course, our website, coalitionradio.us. We blog, we post, and of course, we stream. Last week's podcast featuring disenfranchised youth from the Asian American community in our high schools, in our colleges, here in the city of Providence, up and live, as well as our first broadcast on AM 630, 99.7 FM, revolving around Providence College racial profiling. Still up on our blog website, coalitionradio.us. Joining me, of course, is my co-host. We are just in from the Rhode Island Convention Center, where we live broadcasted on the internet on rifreeradio.org. Today's and tomorrow's Cannabis Convention at 2015. Dave, we're 4 hours into programming. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. Pat bought me lunch, so I consider my consultation fees paid for the month. But a great day, I think, at the Cannabis Convention. We had a lot of great guests on. Certainly, Melissa Bouchard from the Compassion Center was a really compelling guest, I thought.
And we're going to have her on AM 630 with one or two of her patients in the near future at the Slater Compassion Center. Of course, good friend of the show, Jared Moffett, was on, again, advocating for the absolute need to pass regulation and legalization of cannabis in this legislative session. We had our friend from RI Normal, as well as a number of manufacturers who support the medical grow community. That podcast will be up on our website in a matter of days. And, of course, tickets are still available for tomorrow's show at the Rhode Island Convention Center, Ballroom C, starting tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. Dave, talk about some of the things we're doing in terms of the website and our media strategy for our shows and how you can get in touch. Reach out and touch, if you will.
You can get in touch with us on Facebook. That is the Coalition-Talk Radio on Facebook, the Coalition Radio, Facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, and on Twitter at Coalition_radio. Join the conversation. We're monitoring all of our social media live as we speak. So if you have a question, a comment, a concern, a rant, a rave, tweet us, Facebook us. We'll get your message.
Yeah, personal insults are invited. Of course, the insult line is at Twitter at PO Taxpayer. One of the great parts about having a radio show and a blog, and you get to meet all sorts of people that you've always wanted to meet. You get to have discussions with folks that you've always been intrigued by. And today is a very special example of that. As a young man, as a much younger man, I went to a sort of a typical mid-level to higher-level engineering college in eastern Pennsylvania, where politics weren't exactly part of the formula. I became politically aware in my late teens as growing up in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the New York City area with a publication called The Village Voice, which, of course, predates our own wonderful Providence Phoenix, the Boston Dig, all sorts of magazines. They were really one of the inventors of the alternative newspaper. There was a columnist there who is still with us and still occasionally writes, a gentleman by the name of Nat Hentoff. My favorite book of Nat's of all time was a book called Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee. And he excoriated members of the right and the left as he sought to expose the hypocrisy of controlled speech and controlled thought, pointing out that folks who think they were liberal and embracive of other people's disciplines aren't quite so. There is no other person in our area that more embraces that philosophy than our guest today. We have with us for the entire hour Stephen Brown. He's executive director of the Rhode Island ACLU, possibly one of the more sane, low-key, and more controversial figures in Rhode Island you will never meet. He is at the epicenter of all things political here in this state, because in Rhode Island, of course, politics are a contact sport which reach into our everyday lives. My subtitle for this, if you saw some of our social media postings, was, of course, I like to tweak my conservative friends. I am a libertarian, and that means I'm a real conservative. as opposed to my cafeteria conservative Republican friends. Sorry, if you're out there, love you. Why conservatives need the ACLU the most, and yet at the same time they have this incredible love-hate relationship. Talk a little bit about the ACLU. Founded in 1920, I believe, in New York City. Felix Frankfurter, amongst other people, Helen Keller were some of the original founders of the American Civil Liberties Union in its original state. In the coming years, they sought to embrace, and really a lot of the fundamentals, if I get this right, and I'm going to ask Steve to just jump right in. If I get this right, a lot of their early subjects were reactions to the anti-war movement.
That's correct.
And how people were, and if this sounds eerily familiar to the post-9/11 era, please raise your hands and say, I hear you. How people who were anti-war, whether they be Quakers, whether they have religious objections, whether it be medical issues, whether it just be simply political issues, because you were at the same time simultaneously seeing the rise of the American Communist Party, who at that time were a much more mainstream political effort than the marginalized version you see today. So they rose up this organization, this grassroots effort of people to ensure the protection of the First Amendment. Do I have that right?
You do, yes. Well, first, thank you for the very nice introduction. I appreciate it. What's interesting is that the ACLU actually arose during the war. There was an organization that was really the predecessor to the ACLU, and its role was defending conscientious objectors. Mm-hmm. Now, at that time, there was no law that provided protection to individuals who had deeply held religious beliefs, who felt that they could not participate in a war, in any war. They were conscripted. And this predecessor organization defended these individuals who often spent time in prison for their beliefs. After the war, as you noted, there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in the country, and the ACLU spent a lot of time in its initial years dealing with that. And there really are some very eerie similarities to what we saw after 9/11. We're really dealing with the same issues, just in slightly different contexts. But Roger Baldwin, the founder of the ACLU, was often fond of saying that no battle for civil liberties ever stays won. And all you have to do is look at some of the fights that were going on back then and see what's going on now, and you realize how true that is.
Yeah, I've always remarked that tragedy, whether it be in the form of private or public tragedy, often makes for bad public policy. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be, if there's a common thread throughout American politics, American government in the last 100 years, is that we react, or a reactive society, to events of the day, events of the news cycle, and we instantly project that onto a political solution, which often is short-sighted and often fails to recognize that the concept of the slippery slope is not a cliche, that there's it really exists in American government, and the Patriot Act is probably the biggest example of that we live with today. Why, a leading question here, but I say it with love, why do conservatives hate the ACLU so much?
Well, first let me say I don't think that's true of all conservatives.
Real conservatives, as opposed to, yeah.
It depends, and again, people have different definitions of what a conservative is. They shouldn't. I think that's the point. I can't think of a more conservative document than the Bill of Rights, and the ACLU's prime role is defending that. For the most part, that means keeping the government off our backs, which has always been the conservative mantra, at least in theory. Mm-hmm. In practice, it seems to veer from that in some instances. It's keep the government off our backs when we feel like it. But the same thing is true with people on the left. I mean, you mentioned Nat Hentoff, who really did toe the line and say everybody needs to realize that civil liberties are indivisible. You can't pick and choose. One of the most important things about civil liberties is that it protects us all. One of the things I like to do when I give general speeches about the ACLU, I start off with a little quiz, and I ask, what do all these organizations have in common in Rhode Island? Planned Parenthood of Rhode Island, the Rhode Island State Right to Life Committee, mm-hmm. Presidential candidate David Duke, the Urban League of Rhode Island, the American Friends Service Committee, Quaker group, the Rhode Island State Rifle and Revolver Association, the Libertarian Party, the Moderate Party, the Republican Party. What do all these groups have in common? I think there's only one thing they have in common.
And you probably supported all of them.
They've all
The
been
ACLU
represented by the ACLU.
of Rhode Island has represented each of those entities.
Yeah, and Pat likes to point to the ACLU gets lambasted by the conservative right or the pseudo conservative right for their stances on freedom of religion and freedom from religion. Probably most famous locally for Jessica Alquist and the prayer in the Cranston schools. But on the flip side of that, the liberal left, when the ACLU came out and supported Citizens United, the ACLU took a lambasting from the left because they were like, "Oh my God, how can you possibly support this?" But if you're going to go by the Bill of Rights and Supreme Court decisions, the ACLU really didn't have a choice, did they?
Well, no, we didn't. But this has been a theme throughout the ACLU's history. And you're right. Freedom of speech is probably the best example, or freedom of religion, where people on the right and the left find reasons to yell and scream about the ACLU. But it's all to defend a very important principle, and you can't pick and choose. One of the great cases in Supreme Court history dealing with freedom of speech had to do with cases in Martin Luther King's right to march through Selma, Alabama. I mean, we've all been celebrating that in the past year. And, the courts were very clear, notwithstanding the hostility that he was going to face, the threats that he faced if he tried to march. The court said he had a right to do that he could not be prohibited from marching because people who disagreed with it might themselves get violent or try to stop him. What most people don't realize is that the courts, in ruling that, were relying on a Supreme Court decision from the 1940s on behalf of this anti-Semite who spoke at a rally I believe it was in Chicago. The police arrested him, saying he was causing a disturbance because all these people who were opposed to him started getting violent. And the Supreme Court in that case said, no, it's not the people who were violent that get the free ride. People should be allowed to speak, even if it might stir other people up to break the law. You arrest them. You don't arrest the speaker. But it was that decision that really formed the basis for allowing Martin Luther King to do what he did. And I think it's really a great example of this indivisibility of free speech and why it's so critical.
Right. The ACLU also, I believe, had a formative role in the whole Miranda issue, as far as people being given their rights before an arrest.
Well, the ACLU has been involved in a lot of criminal justice issues, and I think that also is one of the more controversial areas, that the ACLU handles. We're defending criminals and all this, and what we're really defending are very basic constitutional rights.
Yeah. One of our central suppositions on the show, and that we've dived into in the last few weeks because of the Black Lives Matter issue, because of the stop and frisk, because of the jump out boys in Providence Police Department, all those issues, has been that the gradual erosion of civil rights there's no longer an immunity by middle class whites that defined a lot of their political opposition to the ACLU over the years. If you start to look at what's coming out from some of I'll call it the right wing libertarian Rand Paul, Ron Paul, traditionally middle-class white political element of the Republican Party, it's his continual objections, for example, the folks in Pawtucket, to overreaching by the police into the traditionally safe white community. It's our position that there are no barriers or boundaries anymore to the encroachment of civil liberties by the government, that it's no longer safe to just point to folks in the African-American community or in the minority community as saying, well, that's them, and we have nothing to fear anymore because we've done nothing wrong. And that, to me, is the central message of the ACLU in here in Rhode Island, is that no one is really safe.
Well, I think that's true. I think that's always been true. However, to be fair, I do think that some people are less safe than others. I think, racial minorities, no matter what, still have the short end of the stick, but it's absolutely true. I think it's also important to recognize just how pervasive